Good morning. I've been asked to give some welcome remarks today, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Rice University's Baker Institute. Thank you for joining us to this wonderful program on the Texas coral reefs. Many of you were here last night to see the beautiful photography from Jesse Cancelmo of the reefs, and I think there's still some books available if you're interested. Today we're going to do hopefully some additional pictures because those were beautiful last night, as well as address what's on the title of the conference, which is both today, what's been happening before, as well as what's we're looking towards the future, and how reefs will be changed in the future. I want to really start by thanking all the co-sponsors and organizers of this event. First, starting with the Center for the Study of Environment and Society at Rice, CSES, which was more known, as well as the Shell Center for Sustainability, another sponsor, and the Hart Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies at Texas A&M University in Corpus Christi. They were actually really the driving force, I think, of today's event and yesterday's events, and deserve much of the credit for the outstanding program you're going to see today. I wanted to specifically thank some of my collaborators, first being Andre Draxler, Professor of Earth Sciences and Director of CSES at Rice, and he's also now a Baker Institute Scholar, so we look forward to future collaborations with him. I want to thank his assistant, Andrea, who's been vital to putting all the pieces together, as well as the support of Wes Tunnell from the Hart Research Institute for helping develop the program. I'm speaking today on behalf of the Baker Institute. I'm the program manager and fellow for the Science and Technology Policy Program. Our mission is to engage policymakers and scientists in a substantive dialogue with hope that public policy will more accurately reflect scientific knowledge in the future. We feel like today's discussion is a great example of such a dialogue, and I look forward to future collaborations with Andre and Wes on this topic, as well as others related to environmental policy and climate change. I think coral reefs are an important but fragile part of the planet's ecosystem. Regardless of your beliefs on climate change and global warming, conserving our planet's priceless natural resources is indeed a major challenge, current and future generations, that we need to start looking at now. I look forward to hearing today's speakers and participating in great dialogue, and I'm going to turn the podium over now to Dr. Draxler.
Good morning. Thank you for coming. On behalf of CSES, thank you very much to the Baker Institute to host us here yesterday and today, as you know, and you can witness. This is a fantastic facilities, but fantastic people also within these facilities who give us kind of these great opportunities kind of to gather together, to even have this broadcast live, and all of this is going to be recorded and available, kind of in the future on the Baker website. I'm the geologist. I'm the yesterday. I feel like ancient myself often, especially kind of at the beginning of the semester when you have your new bunch of students coming in. I always feel that they look so much younger than the previous years, but they're always the same age, as you know. But so I am a geologist, and I didn't do too much on these, Texas coral reef, beside kind of one little work, and I'm going to present it at the beginning of the afternoon. These reefs are obviously very exciting and interesting in terms of the geology. Bill Precht is going to kind of to give us, an interesting, kind of point of view, also in terms of the geology of these reefs. And when you think about Texas, doesn't seem kind of to be the perfect environments for reefs. We saw yesterday that they are beautiful and even, kind of probably even nicer than some of these Caribbean reefs that have sustained terrible damage in the past 20 years. But when you look at the coast and when you wade on a beach in Galveston and you cannot see your feet, kind of a foot down, you just feel, my God. This is the world of John Anderson, my colleague, in the Earth Science Department, is the guy, the person who looks at this siliciclastic, and is going to give a talk, on this also, early this afternoon. Siliciclastic and reefs are not always, kind of good friends. They can somehow, like probably a good marriage, you can live together, nicely together, but sometimes one might be overwhelming, And siliciclastic can be overwhelming for these, kind of system. So for me, when I first came to Rice about, amazingly enough, a quarter century ago, the Texas, even Texas Reef, I didn't even know that existed. And the geology of it, I didn't even know much about, kind of them, until I started to read, kind of the work that Texas A&M did, kind of in the 70s, kind of mid-70s. They did a lot of, kind of work on the geology of these reefs. And John Anderson is the director of the Shell Center for Sustainability, and since he became the director, has really refocused kind of the emphasis of the Shell Center to Texas kind of issues. So this is kind of the way kind of this workshop kind of was initiated, at least in my head. I thought if I can really bring something to the Shell Center is kind of to bring people talking and gathering around the topic of these Texas kind of reefs. So that's the way it started. I've been involved in these deep reefs, and I've tried for probably more than a decade now to try to drill them. If you're a geologist, you have to drill them in order to understand them. And I have not been successful yet, kind of to drill them. But through kind of this push to drill these, I needed some data, and I went kind of to Texas A&M in Corpus Christi, met Wes, gave a talk there 2 years ago, and received kind of some of the first multi-beam maps of these reefs. And this started this connection with the Harty kind of institute, and made kind of this absolutely kind of wonderful collaboration. As you might know, or maybe you don't know, but mid-September we are going to go on a research cruise, and Wes is going to give you probably more details about this. We were going to spend 2 weeks to survey some of these deep reefs offshore Corpus Christi. All right, enough kind of to talk about the way kind of this workshop kind of the idea evolved, and the logistics came up, and thanks that the Baker Institute was willing kind of to welcome us here. So I want to now bring Wes to the podium with our co-chair, and he's going to probably tell us more about today, and most likely also tomorrow. But Wes is a biologist, so please.
Thank you, Andre. Thanks to all of you for coming to spend the day with us today. We had this idea, Andre came up with the idea first about bringing a group together. And if it had been left to he and I, we'd probably be meeting in his lab today with all of you. But fortunately, he had the connection with the Baker Institute, and they really make us look good. So we really appreciate the connection we made here and all of you coming to be with us. I actually started studying these banks as a master's student with Billy Causey, who I introduced to some of you last night. Billy's with NOAA now, but he was from Corpus Christi, and we were in graduate school together. And we studied a little bank called 7.5 Fathom Reef, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a moment. But when I started studying that as a young master's student, using diving as the technique, I thought and heard about these other banks that were further offshore. And here for my whole career, I have wondered about them, what they were formed like, what they were. Billy and I talked about how can we ever get out there to study those. And so the whole career just about went, and I'm just about sliding down now. And here comes this opportunity to go study them for free. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. But Andre came up with this idea before we go on this cruise, maybe we need to bring folks together and talk about the South Texas banks as well as kind of the North Texas banks, all of those in the Northwestern Gulf, in an interdisciplinary sense. He knew the geology connections and I knew the biology connections. And so we're truly going to make this kind of an interdisciplinary discussion today, from policy and law to science, geology, biology, chemistry kinds of things. Industry will be involved, and conservation or sanctuaries. So we'll have quite a cross-section of interdisciplinary discussions about what's going on the Northwestern Gulf of Mexico reefs and banks. If you are not familiar with the area, my best description is the continental shelf of Texas is like a flat plain out there. And these reefs and banks stick up like little hills or mountains out across them, if you think in your mind's eye. If you were to drive, say, from here to Brownsville, It's pretty flat all the way there. And think if you would look out in the distance and you'd see a hill or a mountain standing up out there. It's like, wow, that's crazy. Well, that's what's out there on the shelf. The big ones are towards the edge of the shelf and upper slope. Some of them are quite small, rock size, about the size of this room. We don't know a whole lot about some of them, and we know quite a bit about some. You heard last night the flower gardens. And so our idea is to raise the awareness with this workshop to the public, also to the scientists, and stimulate more interest about this as we start to learn more about them, particularly with this cruise coming up. Before I start the first talk today, and our program will be set where we have 30-minute time slots for each of our speakers. We've asked them to speak for about 20 minutes to allow then time for questions and then the interchange to the next speaker. We will, at the end of the day, have a closing discussion time where they'll all be available for discussion. But we would like to have, at the end of each talk, at least 5 to 7 minutes or so of questions from the audience. So please feel free to put those together as you hear the various people talking. Before we do that, I don't think everybody here was here last night, and so we want to show this little video clip from Sylvia Earle that we showed last night, just so that everybody can be up to speed on her love and intention of the Gulf of Mexico. I think everybody probably knows who she is, explorer in residence at the National Geographic and world-famous explorer. She's in the Cook Islands now, saving the oceans like she usually does, and she was going to be here with us but couldn't. But we were able to get her to do a little video clip when she was diving with the Hart Research Institute annual trip to the flower gardens just a few weeks ago. So we're going to show this little 3-minute clip to you first before we get started.
On behalf of the Baker Institute and the Hart Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies, I want to welcome you to this conference on Texas coral reefs. I'm Sylvia Earle. I'm an ocean explorer in residence at the National Geographic, and I've been associated with the Hart Research Institute since it was founded in 2000. This celebration, this conference, is an occasion to really dive into what is now known, the past, the present, and maybe to anticipate the future of the coral reefs that are here in Texas, here in the Gulf of Mexico, where I'm standing at the moment. I wish I could be with you, but I certainly am there in spirit to celebrate this occasion where scientists, policymakers, artists, those associated with industry, people who care about the Texas coral reefs, about the future of the blue Texas, that area beyond the shore out into the Gulf. This is the time, the first time, that we really understand how important the Gulf of Mexico is and the coral reefs that lie within that system, that how important they really are. When I was a kid, I knew about the Gulf of Mexico and knew about coral reefs down in the Florida Keys, and even some that were near where I lived along the Florida West Coast. But coral reefs in Texas? Who knew? It was not until the mid-1960s that I heard about the flower garden banks. And it was later that I understood that, you know, there are coral reefs all along the Texas coast and continuing on down to Mexico. I mean, the corals don't stop just because there's a border, nor all the creatures that are associated with these reefs. Now we know what we couldn't know 50 years ago. If we wait another 50 years to take actions now to protect these undersea treasures, we're going to lose options that are now available to us. Now we know that humans have the power to influence not just coral reefs, not just the ocean, but the nature of nature. And that now is the moment in history when really, for the first time, we have information, and this conference really begins to connect the dots about what we know, what we need to know in order to make smart decisions about the future. The coral reefs, of course, but they're symbols really of the greater issues that are being addressed as the underlying theme of this conference. So I wish I were there with you. I wish you were here with me in the Gulf of Mexico. Mainly, I really hope that this conference will result in a step forward, a giant step forward, in terms of understanding the Gulf and taking action to ensure that the future is going to be at least as good as what we have today. And with knowing and the caring that comes with knowing, there's a good chance that our legacy will be, and your legacy will be, that the Texas coral reefs of today will be better tomorrow.
Okay, our kind of format for today, we're divided into 3 sections. If you didn't pick up one of the little programs, there are some outside the door here. When we take our first break, you can pick one of those up. So we'll be set up by today is what our first 3 speakers will be about. And you actually see the names up there, but we're not going to sit up here because then we can't watch. And then at lunch, Greg Stuns, our endowed chair for fisheries and ocean health at the Hart Institute, is going to talk to us about artificial reefs. It'll be a little bit of a diversion from all these natural reefs and banks that we'll be talking about. Greg is a specialist in that and studying the fish and fisheries of the South Texas coast and continental shelf. And then this afternoon, we'll do the yesterday part, the geologic things, with Andre and John. And then at the end of the day, we'll do the future, what's going to be happening down the road, maybe looking at the present and projecting into the future with various topics. So that's kind of the layout for us. My task is to talk to you about the South Texas banks. And so I want to learn how to use this thing. There we go. I want to start broadly and then kind of zoom in on the South Texas banks. And so I just first show you here a picture of the entire Gulf of Mexico so you can see where coral reefs are located. The predominance of them are located in the southern Gulf of Mexico in this area. Some of you are aware of a book that I did a couple of years ago after actually my whole career of studying in this area on these reefs, called The Coral Reefs of the Southern Gulf of Mexico. So this is, you could take this and plop it down in the Caribbean, or you could go visit there and you would think you were in the Caribbean. Most people don't think of the Gulf of Mexico that way, but these great reefs that are along the shoreline in this area, which causes some problems when you're close to shore, either with the sediments that Andre was talking about a while ago, or the freshwater inflow and that sort of thing, or too many people. And then in the Yucatan, they're scattered along the edge of the continental shelf, and they're in much better shape there because they're further from shore and harder to get to. There's a series of reefs all along this northern coast that we call the Gulf of Mexico section of Cuba. It's a typical kind of Caribbean coral reef, seagrass, mangrove shoreline. Then, of course, the Florida Keys along here, and then the now famous and in recent years Pulley Ridge, a deep coral reef in that area. Then we have these 2 northern Gulf areas that are quite distinctly different from the southern Gulf and different from each other. These are not really coral reefs over here. It's kind of scattered corals on hard bottom in that area called the Florida Middle Grounds. And then the true reefs that you saw from Jesse's pictures last night if you were here. But those are the true coral reefs for the northern Gulf of Mexico that many people in Texas do not realize that we have. And so they're the really ones that are in great shape comparatively speaking. 50% are over coral cover, and G.P. Schmall, the superintendent of that sanctuary, will talk to us this afternoon. 50% coverage there. That's almost unheard of anywhere in the world anymore. So it's really a wonderful place for Texas and the Gulf of Mexico. So let's zoom in then to the northwestern Gulf of Mexico. And so what I'm saying is northwestern Gulf, kind of from the Mississippi Delta River area to the South Texas-Mexico border. This is what we're calling the northwestern Gulf of Mexico. And so these are too small for you to see, but I wanted you to see the whole area. There's a duplicate of this and a big 6-foot poster out in the corner. So if you'd like to see these closer and read the names of these reefs, I encourage you to do that. I'll tell you a little bit about some of the scientists in just a moment, but just in brief, the majority of these banks are caused by salt domes or salt diapiers that have pushed up the sediment and rock in those areas. And the corals live on the top of the flower garden banks and a few scattered corals on some of the others. So these are kind of salt dome extrusions or expressions in this area. These that are in this area are more old relic shoreline types of hard rock bottom. Some of them are shell banks that were former beaches before the sea transgressed across the continental shelf. Andre and John will tell you about the geology of the shelf later. John, the sediments that are in the area and how they kind of mess up our coral reefs. And Andre about these banks down here that I'll be focused on the geologic side. There's kind of a border that runs from Matagorda Bay out across here. So all of these that are in this area, that are in the offshore area, kind of on the outer edge, mid to outer shelf here, are not salt dome expressions like all of these over here. As Andre pointed out in his study in 1999, I think was the publication of it, that they're coral algal reefs or coralgal, combining those words together. So they were old coral reefs 10 to 18,000 years ago, and he'll be telling you the kind of story that goes along with that now. But we just don't know much about those. And so I want to show you a little bit about what we do over the next few minutes. There are some other banks in this area that are closer to shore that are, again, shoreline expressions of old beach ridges and that sort of thing. And then this one little small one, 7.5 Fathom Reef, that I'll tell you about in a moment, that's quite different than all the rest of them in its origin. So here we zoom in a little bit closer to the South Texas banks. There are 22 of these that we have named and labeled now from the literature and studies and other places that we were able to put all of this together. And so that's what I want to share with you a bit about over the next several minutes. 4 or 5 of these have been studied more than all the rest of them together. In the South Texas area, people call them oftentimes the snapper banks because they go out there to go snapper fishing. Very, very popular out of Port Aransas and out of Port Mansfield to go out to that area for fishing. So here's kind of a vignette. There's a lot more people, but this just gives you a little bit of a timeline. In 1930 was the first time that scientists published about any of these banks. And in this case, it was in Mississippi Canyon off the Mississippi Delta. Before this time, we used to use wire lines or sounding devices where in the late 1800s, they would use kind of a piano wire to run off the bottom and hit the bottom and then take their measurements that way. And there were hundreds of thousands of these measurements made at first in the Gulf of Mexico, and that's how we did the early mapping. But Trowbridge found this hard bottom area, so he was the first one to publish on this. Shepard did this great study, classic study of the sediments of the entire continental shelf area, but he also noted these banks, and that was in 37, so you see quite a while back. Carsey was the first one in 1950 to propose the salt dome origin. Those of you that live in southeast Texas know about even these salt dome expressions along the coast here. High Island, just above Galveston on the coast out there, is an expression of salt dome. If you go out to that area and you see oil and gas wells sprinkled around those, it's because oil and gas is trapped as these salt domes push up the rocks around the area. So they're very important for oil and gas industry and extraction. Curry in 1960 was the first one to talk about some of this origin that I mentioned to you a while ago. Those near shore are kind of late Pleistocene or early Holocene shoreline expressions, and then the offshore ones being the salt domes. And then Texas A&M really got interested more in the banks off the Texas coast in the 1970s. They formed the oceanography department at Texas A&M in the late 40s, early 50s, and became one of the leading oceanographic programs in the United States, actually in the world. But they had some people who came on board in the 60s that became very interested in these banks to study them, and particularly 2 people, Richard Rezac, a geologist, and Tom Bright, a biologist, and they kind of led the way of doing these studies out on the shelf. And so Edwards in this one is actually a graduate student of Richard Rezac, And they did this survey, and they came up with, at that time, about 40 of these coral algal reefs that were mainly in the Northwestern Gulf off Louisiana and Texas, weren't considering those that were further down. And then RESAC published with Tom Bright, it was actually RESAC, Bright, and McGrail, one of their students, a book after about a 5-year study of the banks, or topographic highs, as they called it, from the Minerals Management Service at that time, for studying all of these banks of the Northwestern Gulf of Mexico. So they did this great survey and then published a hardbound book called The Reefs and Banks of the Northwestern Gulf of Mexico. And so it's kind of the Bible for anybody who wants to study these reefs and banks, because it's the one document that kind of puts them all together for you to look at. And so these guys actually got different little mini submersibles at that time in the 1970s and studied the flower garden banks extensively, but they occasionally ventured out to other reefs and banks in the area, even down to South Texas, to the South Texas banks. And then the last name you see there is a scientist that's currently at Texas A&M in the Oceanography Department, Troy Holcomb. Troy has worked with Dr. Bill Bryant, who's one of the famous geological oceanographers in the Gulf of Mexico at A&M for the last 40 or 50 years. Been there a very, very long time, really contributed to the mapping and bathymetry of the Northwestern Gulf. Troy has put together what he calls a gazetteer. And so this gazetteer is a listing of all the information, the names of the banks, the depths to the bottom, the depths to the top, the size, the mapping that's been done, the etiology of the name. Why was it called Hospital Bank, or why was it called RESAC Bank? Some people look at this cluster of banks around the flower gardens and they call them the A&M banks because they're named after a bunch of faculty and students that studied them during the 1970s. And so it's a really good thing that Troy Holcomb has done to put all of this information together in this kind of spreadsheet system. And Sea Grant actually funded him for a while to put all of that on some maps. And so Sea Grant has some really nice maps about these. And Troy lists 65 banks. 45 of them are officially named. Did you know that there's an official naming process for these kind of structures in the sea? Well, 45 of them have official names, and the other 20 are named. They're just not officially named as of yet. So there's a real good system anyway for that. The South Texas banks, also called the snapper banks, these Pleistocene coral algal reef banks that Andre will talk to you about more in detail this afternoon. 22 of these, and this just gives you a little bit of a vignette of kind of the depths to their bottom and then the depths to their top. And then the relief, that's the amount of distance between the bottom and the top of these banks as they sit there. So you see there's quite a range in all of this. And then look at the size of these. They're actually, most are in kind of a half square mile or less in size, but all the way down to 0.02, all the way up to 60 square miles. That's East Banks. That's a very, very southern one, almost off the Rio Grande. So it's really a curiosity as to why it's so large in this area. So we're hoping with our mapping that we'll learn some of that in late September. To give you a vignette of history on our knowledge there, the map on the left was state of the art back in the 70s when it was done. We used to use acoustic soundings and other kinds of ways for mapping these banks. It looks kind of like if you've studied in geology and done topographic studies where you can map mountains or hills or valleys. We did the same thing undersea. But the one on the right is the new multi-beam mapping. And in this case, there's a instrument that's placed on the bottom of the ship, and you drive over the top of these things. And sometimes you have to do what we call mowing the grass. You just go back and forth depending upon the size of the structure. You gather all this data, and then people who are specially trained in that with giant computers and software, they're able to make these bank pictures then that you can see. And then you can overlay topographic lines on that or bathymetric lines on that. When my students first saw this one, Southern Bank, which is the one that's best known in South Texas, they said, you need to rename that bank. It should be Mickey Mouse Bank. This is one of the major contributions of Bright and RESAC and all their sub work was to make these kind of biotic profiles. That book that I mentioned to you a while ago, Rezac et al., The Reefs and Banks of the Northwestern Gulf of Mexico, has a whole series of these diagrams in it, looking at the biota and its distribution across these banks. And so they made a really good contribution to that. One thing that I'll point out that makes the South Texas banks difficult to work with, and you probably can't read it here, is this line right here. It talks about, this is kind of the level of the nepheloid layer. The nepheloid layer, and maybe John's going to explain that in his talk later on, it's this fine sediment that drifts along the bottom, and it can move at different levels out on the continental shelf. I've been diving out there before. Some people refer to it as a false bottom. You can be swimming over it, and it looks like the bottom because it looks like sediment or mud on the bottom, but you can go down and stick your arm into it, and it's water, but it's this real dense layer of sediment. And so, as you can imagine, wherever that comes up on the slope of any of these banks, it's going to really choke out the filter-feeding kinds of organisms that are there. So it's really a concern of natural issue that's all across the banks. And so we had this nice opportunity in 2009 with the National Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary to use the RV Manta, their new vessel, to go out and use the National Undersea Research Center ROV to do some looking via ROV on these banks. This is that Mickey Mouse bank that I showed you a while ago. The black line that you see on there is the track of the ROV, and then the little red spots are video digital captures off of this. So I just wanted to show you what some of these banks look like from the video, or the still captures off of that. The one on the left, the bright red that you see is sponge. You can see the butterfly fish that Jesse talked about last night. Those coral things on the left are Antipitherian, or black corals, soft corals. The two fuzzy looking things that you see in the middle are actually two different things. This one is a hydroid in this area, and this one is a crinoid, or a sea lily. It's a type of echinoderm. And then a really nice looking sea cucumber in this one. But look at all the sediments all around this area. A big eye fish, you see how big his eye is. You typically see these red fish that are in this deeper water areas. Some soft corals in the area. Or the reef butterfly. This is the only one of a couple of stony corals that are found in abundance, but there are a couple of the scleractinian, or the normal hard corals, that we would see on the flower gardens. And that's what we really want to do with our new cruise, is to try to see how abundant those might be. These dark colors in kind of purple and reddish tones, even into oranges, are coral and algae. And so they're a structure continuing to build on these banks, and why they're called coral and algae, or coral algal banks. Here, the French angel and both gray angels can be found out in these areas, so it shows the tropical component to these, even in this deep water area. Some of the larger soft corals, like Hypnogorgia, the sea fan. And I didn't have enough room to show you the 22 banks, but Harriet Nash, who will be speaking this afternoon, is doing her PhD on the kind of policy and science of the banks in the Gulf for marine protected areas. And her and a couple of other students surveyed from our biodiversity database at the Hart Institute what all lives on these banks. And you can see that they came up with a total of 877 species there. 7.5 Fathom Reef, 418. And most of that was learned in the late 60s and early 70s from 6 graduate students. Billy and I were the first two to study this little bank only 2 miles offshore of Padre Island. So it's a unique little bank that apparently was a pond or a lake during the Pleistocene. We found vertebrate Pleistocene mammals like mastodons and mammoth bones and teeth on this thing, so it kind of gave us the origin of that, and freshwater snails embedded in the rock. And so we learned the origin of it from that, so it's totally different from the rest, but it has a lot of study that was done on it back in the 60s, late 60s and early 70s, and hasn't been looked at much since that time. This is Harriet's breakdown with our little study group. You can see that the polychaete worms, the annelids, were most abundant, followed by the mollusks, the various seashells, then the fish, for the chordates, and then crabs and shrimp, kind of the top 4 groups that are here. Bryozoans, very important also. Then lastly, this is just a little image of 7.5 Fathom Reef, kind of the new view. Again, this one on the left is what we thought it looked like in the late 60s and early 70s, our little swimming over the surface, kind of drawing on a slate or something. And then this is the multi-beam map from 2006, when we actually had an opportunity to go out and map 6 of the banks at that time. So I'll close with, this is our new opportunity that's coming up. For 2 weeks, late in September, we'll be going out and trying to multi-beam map all the rest of those 22 banks. We have about 6.5 of them already done. So we have a big task of trying to map all the rest to kind of lay the foundation for future studies regarding these banks. The Falkor belongs to the Schmidt Ocean Institute. Eric Schmidt is the CEO of Google. And Sylvia Earle convinced him, rightly so, that if he wanted to help the ocean, one of the best things he could do was build an oceanographic vessel and let scientists go study on it for free. And so this is kind of the test case that we were very fortunate to become the first part of this. And so we're going to be going to sea for 2 weeks for free. These kind of ships usually cost about $25,000 to $30,000 a day to do this. As a crew of about 20 people on it. We'll have 13 scientists on our cruise. Greg Stuns, who will talk to you at lunch, will be going out after us looking at artificial reefs and fish. So it's really a tremendous opportunity. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody later on about it. And I think my time is about up, so let me see if you have any questions. All right.
What's that ship's operating area going to be? Any ideas? Any vision for that?
They're still kind of working on that. The original plan, Steve, was to have a board of top-level scientists, and they had 8 of them on that board. Tom Shirley was our connection to that from the Heart Institute. And so they came up with ideas of places and things that needed to be studied, and these were scientists from the East Coast, Gulf Coast, and West Coast. And they kind of set out about a 2-year plan of study. And they got the ship fixed and built. It just sailed over from Germany to Woods Hole and went to St. Pete about 2 days ago. Tom and I went to go look at it Wednesday of this week. And so Tom was fortunate to be the one that they chose the first study for the Gulf of Mexico. And so they disbanded the board now. And so nobody's really sure about how it's going to operate in the future, whether it's going to remain maybe kind of a bidding kind of thing to people come up with the best science and then you get to get on it for free, or if they're going to start charging. We just don't know what the case is right now. But I think it's set for this first year is going to be mainly kind of a shakedown of all the things on
it. Is it set up for telepresence? I see it's got a satellite dome on it. Is it such that be able to broadcast this live?
You would think from Google that they would be able to do that. Yeah, it's got 2 of those big satellite domes on there, and we didn't ask that when we were there, Bill, the other day, but that's a good question. I'll check on that. I would bet that eventually it will have it on there. They're really just kind of continuing. Every time they come to port, they add more things to it. Really an exciting deal. Anybody else? Billy?
Wes, are you seeing more interest in the study in the natural resources of the reefs and banks? Are graduate students interested in that right now? Or we grew up in a period of documentation and survey and species lists and things like that. Mm-hmm. And we went for such a long period of not doing that, and now we wish we had that kind of information.
Yep. Yeah, that's an enigma to me. I still like the exploratory discovery kinds of things, to go out and see these, and so that's why the ship opportunity is such a great thing. But there's been, I think, more of a shift towards processes and ecological functions and those kind of things. I guess we don't have a cadre of students at our university who's into that offshore study, and part of it, I think, comes from the expense and being able to get a grant to be able to go do that. A lot of students would love to do that, but boy, just getting to do it is crazy because it's so expensive. And so I think that's a huge holdback to it. And that's part of the reason Sylvia convinced Eric Schmidt to do this, is we need to have more ships. For those who don't know, Most of the ships in the Gulf of Mexico, research ships, are gone. They're not around anymore. We're deprived or depauperated in the Gulf of Mexico for ships. And so this is a good start. We hope to correct that. Even NSF is hopefully going to work towards helping us with that, but those are long ways down the road. Yes, ma'am.
Coming to the title of your talk, What We Know and What We Don't, it's hard to know what you don't know, but nibbling at that, what are you most concerned about as a knowledge gap for the South Texas banks?
To me, since I kind of love biodiversity, it's really knowing the biodiversity of the total banks, but also the kind of habitat and zonation of those. And how does that fit within the habitats and zonation of those that we know better from the Northwestern Gulf? So kind of where does it fit within there? And then they're important as stepping stones from the southern Gulf of Mexico where coral reefs are. Apparently some of the fish you saw and maybe some of the invertebrates use these as stepping stones here before they go up to the flower gardens. So they could be a really important link in what we call connectivity. Some other people will talk about this connectivity. So finding out how they are connected is really going to be important. Okay, I think it's time for us to move on to our next speaker. I'm not going to give detailed descriptions or bios of these people. They have really nice bios, so about a paragraph or so on each person in here, so please check those out if you like. G.P. Schmall is the superintendent of the Flower Gardens Banks National Marine Sanctuary. He came over from the Florida Keys, brought all that great experience, and is really doing a great job taking care of our flower gardens. So, G.P.
All right, thank you, Wes. And is this up on the screen yet? All right. First, I would also like to thank Andre Doxler and Wes Tunnell for putting this workshop together. I think this is really kind of a landmark meeting. It's been a long time coming. Just the fact that we're having a meeting about Texas coral reefs is exciting and shows the importance and the interest in this very unique community. So thank you for your interest and your vision. I think it's going to prove to be very important. When we talk about Texas coral reefs, obviously the flower garden banks are sort of the crown jewels of the true coral reefs of Texas. There are a lot of other communities, as we'll see and talk about throughout the day, that are what I kind of term coral communities. They're not primarily coral reefs in the true sense, but they do offer habitat for a variety of corals. And in this changing environment that we are in the future, may prove to be reservoirs of coral communities and coral reefs in the long term. I think most people know where we're talking about, but the flower garden banks are located off the coast of Texas and Louisiana. If you drew a line straight down from the Texas-Louisiana border, that's where they sit, right along the edge of the continental shelf. And Wes gave a good overview of the reefs and banks in that area, so I don't need to talk too much about that. They are spectacular coral reefs. They're made up primarily, they're different than other coral reefs in the Caribbean and Florida. They're made primarily up of large boulders of star coral and brain coral. Very high coral cover has been mentioned before. The total number of species is not very large in terms of the Caribbean in general. We only have 20 to 25 species documented at the flower garden banks, whereas the entire range of species in the Caribbean is in around the 60 or so range. But the ones that are there are very prolific, very healthy, at least at this time. And of course, these coral reefs support a whole variety of coral-associated animals, both vertebrates, as in fish, and invertebrates of all sorts. The northernmost coral reefs in the continental United States, they have been designated as a National Marine Sanctuary, administered by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. And it's the only National Marine Sanctuary in the Gulf of Mexico, but there are 14 National Marine Sanctuaries around around the United States and in territorial waters. The entire sanctuary is about 56 square nautical miles. In addition to the corals and the invertebrates and the small fish and invertebrates, it's also, as Jesse Conselmo was talking about last night, is also a place where large animals visit fairly frequently. And it's one of those places that you can have encounters with large animals like whale sharks, manta rays, sea turtles, and other things. And humans. As you can see, scuba diving has been and continues to be a very important activity at the Flower Garden Banks. And this is like this picture because this is about 80 feet of water. The diver is hovering over the reef, maybe 20 or 30 feet up, and you can actually see the outline of the boat on the surface as well. It just kind of gives you an idea of the clarity of the water out there. And which, of course, has allowed coral reefs to develop. Wes kind of showed you this general area, but I just want to reinforce, the location of the Flower Garden Banks in relation to both the shoreline, and this is that shelf edge that Wes talked about, and this is where it starts dropping off fairly rapidly into the deep parts of the Gulf of Mexico. And it's along this shelf edges where these topographic features are primarily concentrated, and there's a number of them to the east of the Flower Garden Banks. Just to show a little bit close-up of what these banks really look like, they are formed by salt dome activity. And this is the East Flower Garden Bank. And I just want to point out that the coral reef part, the true coral reef part, is actually a fairly small part of the bank. This is kind of color-coded for depth, and so the more red it is, the shallower it is. And when I mean shallow, the shallowest point of the Flower Garden Banks is about 60 feet deep. So this red part right here, and to some extent this area right here, is really the only true coral reef part of the bank, and that's where most of the study has gone on. And there's some very interesting habitats in addition to the coral reefs at both the East and West Flower Garden Banks, but I'm going to concentrate on the coral part today. There's one kind of interesting feature, though, at the East Flower Garden Bank, which demonstrates that salt dome origin of the bank, and this is a brine seep, and the brine seep is a very interesting spot. This is where actually the underlying salt of the salt dome is sort of coming out, of areas, and since this salt is very the salt water that it forms is about 200 parts per thousand or more, compared to seawater is about 35 parts per thousand. So it's very dense, and it sits on the bottom of the seafloor. And as you're diving over it, it actually looks like a lake, and you think you're looking, like you're on land looking at a lake, because it's a very dense layer of water. Not much can live in it, but some very interesting bacterial action and other kind of weird critters do hang out in the brine seep. The West Flower Garden Bank is similar, and again, the diveable portion, the coral reef portion, is kind of the red part here. And so what is all of this other stuff, And it's a variety of habitats, but one thing that we're getting very interested in is the deeper water communities that occur within the sanctuary. And this is over 50 meters in depth, down to deepest part of the sanctuary is about 700 feet at one point. But these are rock outcroppings that have lots of associated, in this case, black corals and gorgonians, crinoids, a variety of different kinds of fish, and of course it is fishery habitat for a variety of species like this scamp grouper in this shot. Stetson Bank is a little bit different than the other two banks. It is not a true coral reef, as Jesse mentioned last night. And so I'm not going to spend too much time on Stetson, but I'm going to come back to it in a few minutes because there's something really important I'd like to point out. I kind of looked at the historical the history of the flower garden banks too, and when people first identified them, when they first were located on the charts. And so I, working for the National Ocean Service, I went back through some of the historical charts and tried to find the earliest one that I could see where the flower gardens showed up. And we have charts, pretty good charts going back to 1878, 1892. And as you can see, this is like what Wes was talking about, these lines of bathymetry didn't go very far off the shelf, and it was done in the old-fashioned way of the lead lines like he described. But there were a few expeditions that would take cruises out into the Gulf and do soundings. And at some point, and this is the earliest one I could find in 1910, right here, and you can't see it, but I blew it up here, and there's two little spots here with the designation of CO, which does mean coral, at least on modern charts. So as early as 1910, they showed up on the charts, and there is information that the snapper fishermen were fishing these banks in the very late 1800s and early 1900s. Later on, there was a series of studies on, as Wes was describing, about the reefs and banks of the continental shelf. And this one's kind of interesting. This was in 1956, Parker and Curry. One of the, I'm messing up here. And what they did, of course, in that time, it was before really scuba diving came into play, so they were dredging. And at that time, they dredged up some stuff, and it was mostly algal nodules. And it was interesting. They did get a few bits of live coral, but as you can see, they say here, that there are no large masses of living reef-forming corals. That the platforms were below the depths that corals could live, and they were characterized by these algal nodules and other species. So at that time, we didn't even realize that these were living coral reefs. And there became kind of a debate in the science community anyway about were these reefs living reefs, or were they ancient reefs? What were they? Because they did dredge up also fossil coral. And so, so it wasn't until the very early 1960s, and specifically this expedition that Tom Pulley put together out of the Houston Museum of Natural Science, that scuba diving now had come into play, and they for the first time, documented that these were in fact living coral reefs, and described them in a paper that they titled "Texas to the Tropics," and it was published in 1963, along with some photographs, including this one, which I thought was really cool, other than the fact that they're standing on the coral. It looks kind of pretty much like that still today, which is pretty cool. How can coral reefs exist in this part of the world? Well, it's because of the loop current. Everybody knows about the loop current. But this is what brings warm, clear water up into the Gulf of Mexico. It doesn't really come over the flower garden banks, but you have these spin-off eddies that do come off of the loop current, track to the west, and that's basically why the water is clear out there, why it's warmer than you would expect, and why coral reefs have been able to establish there. They are kind of isolated in that regard. Here's, just kind of shows you a similar map that Wes showed, but the other reef systems throughout the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see the nearest one are the Campeche Banks systems that are over 400 miles away, and the Florida Keys are almost 800 miles away. So they are isolated in that sense, and that's probably why there's not as many species that occur there, because the larval duration of certain species might not be long enough to make that far trip, that kind of thing. And as a lot of folks have mentioned, corals in general are in trouble, big trouble, around the world. This is just a paper that was come out a number of years ago now, but showed the absolute decline of using percent living coral cover as a metric from the late 1970s, when a lot of research really started happening on coral reefs throughout the world, and especially the Caribbean, to at that time, 2002, and it's a steady decline. It's a significant decline. Average hard coral cover reduced by about 80% in that 30-year time period. One of the interesting things, though, is that there are a couple of outliers in that data set, and one of those is the flower garden banks. We've had a monitoring program at flower gardens for a very long time. The first monitoring was done in association with impending oil and gas research in the mid-'70s, and then since 1988, there's actually been annual monitoring that's been supported by MMS and now BOEM, and when the sanctuary was designated in 1992, NOAA is now contributing to that monitoring too, and it's lasted ever since. And the interesting thing about it is that this shows basically percent living coral cover, around 50% in the earliest surveys in the 70s, and as you can see, it's still about that. And if anything, there's maybe a little slight increase over that time period. So in that sense, the reef is doing well in terms of percent cover. It appears to be doing well in terms of just health of the corals, in terms of the incidence of disease is very low compared to other reefs. Other types of mortality is also very low, and this is also shown that we have some very active broadcast spawners at the flower garden banks, and we were just out just a couple of weeks ago to witness the coral spawning event that occurs 8 to 10 nights after the full moon in August and sometimes in September. So I want to talk a little bit about what may be some threats or issues that could affect the reefs, because even though the reefs are doing really well right now, the worldwide prognosis for reefs is not good. I'm very concerned about that the flower garden banks being so healthy, it's kind of only one way to go, and that's down. And so we need to identify what could be affecting these reefs in the future. Oil and gas was the first concern that people had about the health of the reefs at flower garden banks and other places. And this is just a map of infrastructure of the Northwestern Gulf of Mexico. The dots are oil and gas platforms. And so, and as you know, there's over 3,000 oil and gas platforms in the Northwestern Gulf. And so that was really why the monitoring started at flower garden banks in the early days. You know, both the east and west flower garden banks are surrounded by oil and gas activity. We actually have a operating, or we recently stopped operating gas production platform inside the boundary of the sanctuary. And for all our monitoring, and as you can see, the proximity of the oil and gas development has not had an apparent negative effect on coral health at the flower garden banks. So that is a very good thing to know. It's something that the oil and gas industry can point to and say that yes, you know, oil and gas development can occur in close proximity to a natural sensitive area, as long as it's done safely and correctly. But of course, sometimes if there's always a concern of a major event, and of course this is the Deepwater Horizon blowout in 2010, and I wanted to mention that because I get a lot of questions about that and how did it affect flower garden banks or not. And the short answer is no. We have not seen any direct effects of the Macondo well blowout in that incident. You know, this is one reason because we're pretty far away. 200 miles or so from the incident, and the current patterns in that part of the Gulf of Mexico tends to take that those areas to the east, and special kind of conditions that year with the gloop current kind of entrained it in that northeastern part of the Gulf of Mexico. This, for example, is a combined image of the surface oil that was seen over the entire period, and you can see that it spread over. It was never like this at one point, but this is the kind of the cumulative drawing, and the star is the approximate location of the flower garden bank, so you can see it was pretty well away. The closest it got was in early July of 2010, and there was some oil that actually came ashore at Galveston, but it was pretty much near shore, and again, the flower garden banks offshore enough that it was not affected. One thing that we also saw, though, was that in deep water, There was signs of the oil and perhaps the dispersants that did track to the southwest. And but this was very deep, 1,000 meters or so. It didn't, to my knowledge, was never documented to get up onto the shelf. So, so again, that was kind of what was going on related to the Deepwater Horizon and how it in relation to the flower garden banks. We had instruments out at the flower garden banks that we put out there to detect oil if it did come in the vicinity, and we rigged up a series of these instruments along a vertical profile to see if there was differences between the bottom and the surface. As far as we could tell, there was not exposure. The other one other thing that is happening to coral reefs in general is coral bleaching. Coral bleaching is generally caused by warm seawater temperatures. NOAA tracks sea surface temperatures by satellite and are able to, they've worked out basically an algorithm that can show or predict when coral bleaching is going to occur. We've had a couple of bad coral bleaching years in recent times. 2005 was a very bad year throughout the Caribbean, including the Gulf of Mexico. 2010 was another one. And this is the prediction from the Coral Watch program. And you can see that throughout the Caribbean, it was extensive and severe. And there was this little blip up in the Gulf of Mexico as well. And in fact, we did see coral bleaching. This is kind of what it looks like. Typically all of the corals are kind of greenish, yellowish, brownish kind of color, and when they expel their symbiotic algae, they turn white. And you can see kind of the extent of the coral bleaching in 2010. Now, in 2010, most of these corals were recovered. There was very little actual mortality because corals can survive a coral bleaching event if it's not too long, if it's not too severe. So it did affect the flower garden banks. So far, it hasn't affected it to the point where it's really bad. We have a new threat. The red lionfish has invaded the Caribbean and now the Gulf of Mexico. 1986 was the first record of it occurring in Florida. This is a fish from the Pacific. Is not native to the Caribbean, and over time, as you can see, it expanded greatly. First, it expanded north, which is kind of interesting, and then down into the Caribbean, and then in 2010, it was documented in the Gulf of Mexico, nearby the flower garden banks, and it wasn't until last year, 2011, that lionfish showed up at the flower garden banks, and we are now actively monitoring that. We take them out and remove them when we can, when we see them, and we allow other people to do that too. The concern with these fish is that they're voracious eaters. Even though they're very small, they eat everything that they can fit in their mouth, and even sometimes bigger than that. And of course, those are little blennies, little gobies, lots of those things, but also the juvenile fish of every species that could be species of commercial or recreational importance. The thing that scares me the most, though, is water quality. If they ask me what I believe the biggest threat to the flower garden banks, and I would say water quality in general, and I'll tell you what I mean. This is, everyone knows about the dead zone. This is from runoff, primarily from the Mississippi River. Every year there seems to be an area off the coast of Louisiana primarily, but it's moving down into Texas too many years. This is from last year, from 2011. These are hypoxic zones, which actually last year wasn't so bad, and this year's actually not bad either because of the drought, essentially. And it doesn't get as far off as the flower garden banks, but usually. But there are events, of course, when there's large runoff events, especially related to storms, to hurricanes especially, where you can get this turbid water, coastal water, coming offshore as far as, in this case, for example, in 2009, it definitely was covering over Stetson Bank for a fairly long period, and the flower garden banks was right just outside of it, so The flower garden banks are far enough offshore that for most of these kinds of events that doesn't get affected. But Stetson Bank already is, and flower garden banks could very well be in the future. Stetson Bank I mentioned because in the last few years we've also seen an abundance of algae there, and it's not good algae, and decline of some of the reef species that occur there. This graph shows that the red line is coral. And in 2005, which seemed to, it corresponded both with a bad bleaching event and two very bad hurricanes, if you remember. And coral populations basically crashed soon after 2005. And algae populations in green went up, and they've stayed up. Coral populations have stayed down. Sponge populations have also decreased. So we're very concerned about this. There's some work going on by NASA showing chlorophyll off the shelf. And Stetson Banks, you can see in this particular one, affected by high levels of chlorophyll. East Bank, not so much. And this shows it here, a big spike in chlorophyll around May time period of that year, and a little bit at the East Bank. So, so we started looking at satellite imagery quite often now to see what's going on. One time we went out to the flower garden banks. We were at the West Flower Garden Bank, and it was beautiful. It was clear. It was like it always was. We go 12 miles east to the East Flower Garden Bank, and it was the really green, murky water. And you're going, what's going on? So when we got back to shore, we looked at the satellite imagery, and this is what we saw. And sure enough, there was this finger of again, this is chlorophyll, that came out, because of the different eddies and the circulation in this area that brought it right over the East Flower Garden Bank in that particular case. So that's what I'm worried about. Kind of running too long here, sorry. I just wanted to mention, though, the other banks that do have coral. A Grail Bank is a true coral reef. It's a deep reef and low species diversity, but it can cover up to 25% of the seafloor there. Bright Bank has a number of coral colonies scattered around. Saunier Bank, primarily fire coral, but has other coral species as well. So there are other coral communities in the Northwestern Gulf of Mexico. The National Marine Sanctuary has gone through a process to look at its management plan, and we recently, in April of this year, published our revised management plan. And in it, there is a sanctuary expansion proposal that I'd like to briefly mention. Many people in the public comments with our Sanctuary Advisory Council felt that some of these other reefs and banks ought to have additional protection that could be provided by the National Marine Sanctuary Program. And a lot of this came from, as we started doing this detailed multi-beam mapping that Wes was also talking about, this detailed mapping has really been so important in trying to figure out what's going on in these areas. And in this case, when we saw what we thought were these isolated features, East Bank, West Bank, Bright Bank, start looking at them, and they're not really that isolated. They're almost all connected in some way. In this case, here's a ridge that connects Rankin Bank and East Flower Garden, and all of this whole complex of three different banks. We called them three different banks. They're actually really one big bank. There's these scarps and patch reefs. So, we felt that these provided these kind of habitat highways, we were calling them, of fish and invertebrates that could move from one bank to another. And so they were all kind of connected, and all were in need of protection. So we went through a process, especially our advisory council, and came up with a proposal that is in our management plan that we just published, and that would add 9 additional reefs and banks to the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary, and this is the recommendation that the advisory council came up with. So it's it would have to go through another process, and this is not anything like, this is not really the preferred alternative right now, but this gives you an idea of the kind of thing that we would be talking about. So that's really all I have to say. I'm really pleased that we're able to come and talk about these incredible areas. Many people, when I travel around the country, I'd say I work in the Gulf of Mexico, and they go, "Oh, I'm sorry," and I don't understand it, because the Gulf of Mexico has kind of a bad rap. People know about the dead zone. They know about all the industrial development here. They go to the beach, and like Andre said, you can't see your feet in the water, but they don't understand the incredible riches that do occur off the shores of Texas. So I hope this will go some way to further protection of those areas. Thank you.
Good time for a couple of questions. John?
You mentioned the oil spill, and I was glad you showed the map that showed all of the offshore platforms, because of course they completely surround, as you pointed out, the flower gardens as well as the South Texas area. And as you also pointed out, the Deepwater Horizon was a very unique spill, and it occurred in a very unique climate situation, oceanographic situation. And if you look at the distribution of those wells and you say, well, the probability of another spills like hurricanes, sooner it's not when it'll happen, it's whether it'll happen, it's when it happens. The probability is that I would argue that given the distribution of the sediments, et cetera, that spill is going to affect Texas. We really dodged the bullet with this one. And that being the case, are there studies currently being done to look at particularly the fine particulate material that's produced by dispersants and how that can affect the reefs, how the organisms, specific organisms, react to contamination from oil and dispersants?
There's probably other folks in the room that know more about that than I do, but I know that the quick answer is yes. I know, especially after the Deepwater Horizon incident, there's been a large amount of money that's being put forward both by BP and other funding organizations to look at that specific question, because that is the thing that concerns me the most. You know, like most of the times, you know, when we have our oil spill drills and things in the vicinity of the flower garden banks, I'm more like, well, let's just let it float over, you know, and until it's out of the sanctuary. And I would advise against using dispersants, because that's what, you know, would bring it down, you know, into the water column and potentially deep enough into the to affect the corals. So I don't. The studies that, you know, have been done on corals, you know, yes, there is oil itself is toxic, dispersants are toxic, and oil and dispersants in combination are toxic. It's just you know, a matter of how, you know, luckily again the flower garden banks is deep enough that even with dispersants, if they're surface applied dispersants, theoretically would not get that deep. But like, as you know, in this event where they were applied at depth, that's a whole different story. And you did see some direct impacts on deep water coral communities in the vicinity of the Deepwater Horizon. So other than that general answer, I don't know. I know that there's a lot of work going on right now.
Can we do one more question with Clint?
Yeah, just to clarify, I may have misheard you, but did you say that the expansion plan and the management plan is not the preferred alternative now? Or did I just misunderstand?
Oh, I kind of, in my opinion, that it is the preferred alternative. But in the true NEPA language, the National Environmental Policy Act, you know, we still have to go out, you know, and say and develop a preferred alternative and a range of alternatives. And so, you know, most likely we will use the Advisory Council's recommendation as the basis of our preferred alternative. But I just wanted to make sure that what's published in the plan is essentially a recommendation, but is not, you know, an official proposal at this time. That's the way I should have put it.
Okay, thank you, DP.
Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is going to get us down a different trail. Dr. Richard McLaughlin is the Endowed Chair for Policy and Law at the Hart Research Institute at Texas A&M University Corpus Christi. And Rich is going to take us down the Policy and Law Avenue.
I'll give it a try.
Okay.
Thank you very much. During the course of the day, you're going to learn, as you already have with these excellent presentations by Wes and JP, about the importance of coral reefs, about innovative methods to try to protect and manage these remarkable resources. As the only lawyer on the panel today, it is my job to convince all of you that what you really, really want to do, you can't do. And so that's sort of my role here. It's not quite as bad as that, but there are a number of legal issues that we have to deal with, international legal issues, when we are trying to determine how to best protect these resources. And whenever you are talking about international law in any ocean area, including the Gulf of Mexico, the first source of law that you always have to look at is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the so-called most important international treaty ever negotiated. I think that's true. I think that most of my colleagues believe it is the most important multilateral treaty ever negotiated for a variety of reasons. One is the fact that it involved every nation on Earth. Even landlocked nations that don't face the oceans were participants in the negotiations. Second, and this is very important, unlike most treaties which make decisions based on supermajority votes, if 75 or 80% of the delegates agree to something, then it's included in the language of the treaty. In the case of the Law of the Sea Convention, it was negotiated by consensus. And what that means is that every single word of every provision in that treaty was agreed upon by every participant. Now, what that did, in addition to making this a very long negotiation, about 10 continuous years of negotiations, but ultimately what it did is created what is known as instantaneous customary law. And the importance of that is the fact that even if you are not a party, a state party to a treaty, if it is viewed as customary law, then you're still bound by that treaty. And in the case of the Law of the Sea Convention and managing coral reefs, the reason that's important is although Mexico and Cuba are colleagues that surround the Gulf, are parties to the Law of the Sea Convention, the United States is not a party. This is, I don't want to get into this. It's a very controversial issue. It is being debated right now in the Senate as we talk here today. We may or may not be a party by the time of the elections, probably not. But in any event, it doesn't matter that much because the United States has publicly agreed that the Law of the Sea Convention represents customary law, and therefore the United States is bound by its provisions as well. Now, just to kind of talk to you about the convention so that you have some understanding of how this system works. Prior to this convention and a couple of other conventions around the same time, the traditional 300-year law was that coastal nations had complete authority over the first 3 nautical miles out from their shorelines, the territorial sea. Anything beyond that, anything beyond 3 miles was viewed as open, and there was freedom of the seas, it was high seas, any nation could do anything they wanted to in that area. The change was creating these marine juridical zones that extend from the shoreline all the way out to the middle of the ocean, and to create a balance between the rights of the coastal nations to regulate what happens in the ocean areas off their shores versus the right of the international community to engage in the activities that they have traditionally engaged in ocean areas. So it was always balancing these two. And the way that they did this was to create this series of juridical zones. The top one? Okay. The very first is internal waters. There you're talking about Galveston Bay, Corpus Christi Bay, for example. In that particular zone, the coastal nation has absolute authority. They can do anything they want. They can basically treat that area the same as they treat their land territory. So no problem in the U.S. Regulating what happens on coastal reefs in internal waters. There's also really very little problem in territorial waters. This is a zone that extends out to 12 nautical miles, and under the Law of the Sea Convention, it's treated identically to internal waters with one exception, and that is innocent passage of foreign vessels. So that you have to allow foreign vessels that want to transit through your territorial sea to be able to do so. That doesn't mean that they can stop, they can fish, they can do anything, but if they're merely transiting through the territorial sea, then you can't bother them, you can't stop them. But other than that, you can do anything you want in that area, including preventing any kind of harm to coral reefs. The contiguous zone, which is the next 12-mile zone out to 24, limits the coastal state's authority slightly, because what it does then is it says only in fiscal, customs, or sanitary health circumstances can you exert authority out to 24 miles. So for example, if you have a vessel that you think, a foreign flag vessel that you think might be carrying drugs or might have illegal aliens or something, you can go ahead and stop and board and perhaps seize that vessel out to 24 miles. But beyond that, other than those explicit areas, that is viewed as the high seas. The next zone, which is the exclusive economic zone that extends all the way out to 200 nautical miles, is probably the most important creation of the Law of the Sea Convention. And what it is exactly as the title indicates, it is an economic zone. If the coastal nation is involved in economic activities, in the exploration or exploitation of economic resource activities, then it has exclusive authority. The foreign nations have no authority whatsoever. So if you're talking about oil and gas, or you're talking about fishing, or even offshore wind development, then all the way out to 200 miles, the coastal nation, in the US in this case, has exclusive authority. What it does not have is authority over anything other than economic activities. So if you have a foreign flag vessel that's engaged in navigation, you can't prevent that ship from going where it wants to go. If they want to engage in military activities, you can't prevent that. If they want to spy out there, they can do that. It's really treated as the high seas, with the exception of just these economic activities. And we'll find out that will have some consequences, perhaps, in managing coral reef areas. The last two zones, continental shelf and international waters, we won't have to worry about those today, because there are really no coral reefs in those zones. But let's talk a little more about exclusive economic zones. This is why they're important. They're important because huge amounts of the ocean, and in fact those areas of the ocean that are most likely going to have coral reefs, for example, would fall within exclusive economic zones. And I especially want you to take a look at kind of the wider Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. It's really one giant exclusive economic zone. Some nation controls almost all of that area. If we kind of focus in on the Gulf of Mexico, you can see that is the case, that the northern part is the exclusive economic zone of the United States, the southern part is of Mexico, and the southeastern part is Cuba, with a couple of donut holes or gaps in the middle. These are areas beyond national jurisdiction. They are continental shelf or extended continental shelf or high seas areas beyond national jurisdiction. Once again, there's all kinds of really interesting and unique international legal issues associated with these areas, but there are no coral reefs out there, so we won't really have to worry about those. And instead, I think the point that I want to get across is that most of the banks, reefs, and salt domes that you've heard Wes and GP talk about, and Jesse last night, are all located in areas beyond the territorial sea. So the Flower Garden banks and the Steamboat Lumps and the Campeche banks and a lot of these areas, in fact, most of these, I would say, from looking at those maps, there's very few of these areas that are actually within that 12-mile territorial sea. And instead, almost all of them are located in that area between 12 and 200 miles. And as a consequence, the regime governing the exclusive economic zone is the one that you're going to have to look at whenever you deal with these resources. And Harriet Nash, who provided me with this map, is going to talk a lot more about that this afternoon. All right, very quickly, once again, this means that there are some activities that the U.S. has legal authority to regulate, and there are some activities that they do not have authority to regulate. They can, for example, regulate fishing, hydrocarbon and mineral production, renewable energy, such as offshore wind or other kinds of renewable ocean energy projects. They can protect the marine environment to some extent, but it's always with this condition of balancing the rights and freedoms of the rest of the international community when you're doing so. So it's prescribed to a great extent. And then finally, marine scientific research is an area that the coastal nation does have authority over. Now, what it does not have authority over is the navigation of foreign vessels. So you simply cannot tell foreign vessels, for example, that you cannot transit through protected areas. At least in theory, you can't. You can't prevent them from laying submarine or cables or pipelines. Within the convention, there's an explicit provision providing the notion that that is a freedom of the sea. And therefore, if they wanted to do that somewhere, you would have a difficult time under international law preventing them from doing so. And then interestingly, for those of you that saw Jesse's presentation last night, he talked about the last one, which is treasure salvage. Interestingly, treasure salvage is discussed in the treaty out to 24 miles. So in other words, if you're within the contiguous zone, that first 24 miles, a coastal nation has the right to regulate treasure salvage. If it's beyond that, then it falls under this archaic set of rules known as the maritime law of salvage and fines, and you do not have authority over that. And these were similar to the photos that Jesse showed last night. This has come up just outside of the Flower Garden Marine Sanctuary at Bright Bank, and there has been destruction of reefs, and there has been very little that the government could do about it. We can talk more about that in questions and answers if you want, but generally this is one of those areas where international law does provide some constraints. Now, does that mean that nothing can be done in this regard? No, because the convention does recognize the fact that there must be a balance between environmental freedom and freedom of navigation. In Article 211.6, it provides that special rules and measures may be adopted in particular clearly defined areas of an EEZ if the general rules are inadequate. And I think that's primarily to take into consideration these kinds of special fragile zones that would likely be within the boundaries of a marine sanctuary, for example. Now, to apply these special rules, you have to go to the International Maritime Organization, which is the primary entity that negotiates international navigation treaties and other things with the world community. And you have to request a formal process for this purpose. And that process is known as the Particularly Sensitive Sea Area Process, or PSSA. A nation or a group of nations can go to the IMO and petition and try to prove that they meet certain criteria. And those criteria include having the necessary ecological, social, cultural, economic, scientific, or educational characteristics to comply with the guidelines. It must be at risk for international shipping activities, and there must be measures that can be adopted by the IMO to provide protection. And the IMO has a series of guidelines and standards that define all of these terms and kind of give guidance as to whether or not you would likely be able to meet the criteria or not meet the criteria. So there is an option to go beyond the convention. There are existing PSSAs. The kind of most famous one is the first one, which was the Great Barrier Reef off of Australia. But we do have a couple of them in our general vicinity. One off of Cuba. The Florida Keys has a PSSA. And also the Northwest Hawaiian Island National Monument has a PSSA. Flower Garden Banks does not. I think there's many reasons for that. It may not need one, but the point here is that there are constraints internationally, but at the same time, if we're creative and we do our homework, there in many ways are methods to get around many of those international constraints. But we can't ignore them. We can't act as if they don't exist, because they truly do. So with that, I will take any questions, and thank you very much.
Rich, one thing that was on television a lot during the BP spill was
and afterward was the fact that the fear that China and Cuba could come in and drill up all our oil in the Gulf of Mexico if we did not double our efforts to extract oil. So what you're saying is they really can't do that, except for the Western Gap and the Eastern Gap?
Yeah, they can't even do it there. The only place that they could do it would be in Cuba. And that is the concern. Now, the reason they, at least in theory, couldn't do it in the United States is that the United States has the authority to say no if it chooses to. I don't think it would. The United States basically has an open bidding process. And unless there's some trade sanctions or some requirements why a certain foreign country can't come in and bid for one of those leases and go ahead and engage in oil and gas development in our exclusive economic zone, we generally wouldn't prevent that from happening. So, but we could. That's the point, is that if the United States didn't want China or some other nation to drill in its waters, it has the authority to do so. Mexico has a monopoly. They have Pemex, and they are not going to allow Cuba to go, or China to go in and drill in their waters. The big problem, and it usually came up in the context of Cuba, and the fact that Cuba is now engaged in the process of beginning to explore for offshore oil and gas. And the concern there is, how do we respond if there's an oil spill? I don't think anybody thinks, although there have been some legislative bills and introduced by Florida politicians for the most part, to penalize oil and gas companies that do business with Cuba and some of these, or in some other areas. I don't think they're going very far. And so bottom line on this is the fact that I don't think that's much of a problem. I don't think it's much of a concern. And most of the exploratory wells that have been drilled so far in Cuba have been unsuccessful. There may not be even an offshore oil and gas industry there as far as we know, at least in the near future. So I hope that answers your question. Clint, I'm going to ask you, because I know you're going to say I'm wrong on something, because this is...
I'm curious. This is wonderful. On the lost treaty, in terms of customary law, how did that designation occur? In this administration, Bush, Clinton, what happened?
Actually, Reagan.
Reagan.
Yeah, it went back to the Reagan administration. What happened, and I'll give this very quick historical view. The Reagan administration was perfectly fine with the convention. In fact, we were leaders in negotiating the convention. The one thing that he didn't like was the deep seabed mining provisions. What he basically said in 1983, I believe, was, we will accept as customary law everything in the convention except those provisions. So it was really Reagan that bound the United States to everything other than the deep seabed mining. That was renegotiated, and in 1994, we even changed that complete regime so that now the United States, I think, and many of the former representatives of the Reagan administration said they're perfectly fine with the deep seabed mining provisions now. Those are not an issue anymore, but it's become an ideological battle over whether or not we should be involved in any broad-based UN-dominated agreement like this, and so that's where the political problem is now. But the good thing is that, from my perspective, 99% of the convention is treated as customary international law, and it's still binding treaty on the U.S. Billy.
Rich, great talk. Your slide with the different zones, the contiguous zone, around the states, around the Gulf Coast, Texas and Florida claim 3 leagues or 9 nautical miles. Mm-hmm. And that's from any emergent land. And in your slide, it implied to me that when you looked at the 12-mile territorial sea limit, that it was not from that island that was there. It seemed like that island was there for a purpose, to demonstrate something, but it looked like the territorial sea limit was not measured from that out portion.
You're absolutely right. It's very complex, and that's a very simplistic kind of version of what actually it looks like out there. But you're right. There are all kinds of rules within the law of the sea convention on how you can draw your baselines, which is how you then measure your territorial sea and your exclusive economic zone. And one of the things that it says you can do is to take islands, as long as they're inhabited islands. They can't be rocks with nobody living on them, but if they're inhabited islands, then you can use that as the outer part of your baseline. And so you're absolutely right. There are portions in the Gulf of Mexico, especially with these boundary, with these barrier islands, offshore barrier islands, and with islands, for example, in the Mississippi Sound and other areas that are located 10 to 12 miles offshore, where you might have territorial seas that extend way beyond what you see there. So it's a very complicated set of rules that apply to that.
You may have to be my attorney when I go kick the state of Florida out of some areas.
And that's the other the other complicating factor is that what we have is we have a for purposes of state versus federal law and international law, two states, the Gulf Coast of Florida and the state of Texas, have 9 nautical mile state waters instead of 3, which is the case for everything else. And it gets very complicated there because what we've said, and Reagan said this as well, Reagan said that for purposes of international law, we will apply the 12-mile limit. For purposes of domestic law between the states and the federal government, we'll apply the old 3-mile or 9-mile limit. So it gets really complicated at that point.
Might need a memory assist on this, but at the Flower Gardens, we went through that process of PSSA, something equivalent to it.
Oh, did you?
Well, it ended in a no anchoring provision or designation by IMO. Mindy Johnson did it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But not a PSSA designation, maybe, Billy?
No, but Steve brought up an important point. The Florida Keys got the PSSA because of anchoring the foreign vessels on the Tortugas Bank to the west.
Okay.
And GP was there at the time when we started it, weren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, you did. You
took pictures of the anchors.
and the Flower Gardens, I think Lindy was pursuing that.
She did that first. That was
I got it in place. So I don't know why it didn't go to the PSSA.
Yeah, I don't know either, but it was the first designation of a no anchoring zone by IMO.
Okay. Well, you probably went through an abbreviation of this process. Why we haven't gone back and gone through the full PSSA is probably because we haven't needed it, I guess, so far. It hasn't been an issue. But the important thing is that you did have to go to the IMO. You couldn't just unilaterally say, foreign vessels, you're not allowed to anchor here, because that would be a violation of international law.
The huge benefit about the PSSA is that it puts it on all foreign nautical charts, whereas things that are just on the U.S. nautical chart, you know, flag vessels from some other foreign country may not be using NOAA charts. Most likely they're not using NOAA charts. So that's a huge benefit of the PSSA as opposed to an area to be avoided or some other designation by IMO, which are voluntary to the flag nations.
Okay, very good. Yes?
Yeah, you might want to look into that, Billy, because the biggest threat is foreign tankers coming in and lightering off their loads about 20 miles north of the Flower Gardens. You've got basically the equivalent of 5 super tankers per day offloading, 1,500 super tankers per year in the Gulf, and the biggest number is right up here off Galveston, about 25 miles north of the Flower Gardens. When the Megaborg exploded in 1991 and dumped 100,000 barrels of its million barrels into the water, we were very lucky that that went north and only produced tar balls. If it had gone south for some reason over the Flower Gardens, it would have been a huge threat and a big problem. My question, Richard, on Bright Bank. We just went through the expansion process. We still have the final EIS to go through that will activate the expansion for Bright Bank. Will we or will we not, in your opinion, be able to prohibit another mining operation if it were able to start, since we're farther than 24 miles offshore?
That's an unsettled issue. Technically, the problem is that we have some rights to protect the marine environment out there. And we have the right, for example, to stop fishing from occurring because of essential fish habitat designations and other things. But we technically don't have a right to stop treasure salvage if they are true treasure salvers that have the rights to salvage that vessel. And so this is an untested area. There was, I think we talked about this last night, there is a case out of Florida which found a treasure hunter in violation of the law and fined him $1 million or something. But it was because he did not have a legitimate salvage claim, and he destroyed seagrasses within the marine sanctuary. And so the action was not because he was a treasure salver and could have prevented him from doing what he did. It was because he was an improper treasure salver, and he destroyed in the process a bunch of federal resources, and we have laws against doing that. So you could, I think the way to do it is to be creative and find some way of tying the destruction of the reef to an environmental protection regulation, as opposed to trying to say no treasure salvers may engage in this activity. Because that's where it's very clear that we can't prohibit that, and there's good reason. And the reason is because if we do it, then every other nation will have, under international law, the ability to reciprocate and to do that against us. And so that's why the U.S. government is so concerned about prohibiting things like treasure salvaging. Do we have more
questions?
I was just going to comment about the reauthorization of the Coral Reef Act. And that act is, in its present version, the way I understand it, will greatly expand the federal government's protection of coral reefs in areas that are currently not protected, outside of state boundaries and outside of sanctuaries. So things like Bright Bank will be covered if passed under the new Coral Reef Act.
Yeah, and again, but you're absolutely right, but only if the United States has authority to prevent a particular activity from occurring. So you're absolutely right. For U.S. citizens, for example, we have authority over U.S. citizens. For almost all of these activities that would very likely damage the coral reefs, we would have authority. But for something like treasure hunting, treasure salvage, we may not, despite that federal statute. Bill?
I'm not quite sure how this would play into the particular sensitive PSSA designation, but the Flower Gardens is being submitted to the SPA protocol, a special protected area and wildlife provisions of the Cartagena Convention.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And the Florida Keys has been designated under the SPA protocol. And that may, even though it is setting a standard of protection and conservation management of special places in the Caribbean, it may establish provisions that are recognized internationally about these particular places.
That's important. It's especially important because what that means is the states parties to the Cartagena Convention and the SPA protocol they have agreed. In other words, they've consented to not do something. So under international law, that's good, that group of nations. Now, if they're not members, if they're parties that have not, if they're nations that have not signed that convention, they can go ahead and exercise their international rights any way they see fit. But it does, if you have a widely ascribed to regional treaty, that generally prevents nations from violations. In other words, they're much less likely, and they're going to get a lot more political pressure from their own governments not to do something like engage in treasure salvage or something, if there is a widely based regional treaty in place. So it's important. It's not foolproof, but it's important. And the thing to remember also, just in closing, is that simply because you have the legal right to do something doesn't mean that you're stupid enough to actually do it. Because that's the thing, is for example, I mean, simply because you have the legal right to engage in treasure salvage in the Gulf of Mexico and destroy these reefs, doesn't mean that the United States can't tell you, look, we can't prevent you legally from doing this, but we can really hurt you badly in all bunch of other ways. We're going to stop trade favored status. We're going to do this, and we're going to cause licensing issues on that. So, I mean, the point is there's all kinds of ways for the United States to work beyond the legal regime to get what it wants to get. And that's generally what happens. Other countries realize it, and it's a lot more fluid than you would think with the law. But the point I'm trying to make is the law is there, and you have to at least address it. There's ways around it, but you can't simply ignore it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, that concludes our today's section for this morning. Now we have a 30-minute break set up for you with some goodies out here. We'll holler at you a few minutes before it's time to come back in at 11:15. Thank you.
Right, yes. Rich is the only attorney.